Hello, and welcome to Crime Enigma. I'm your host, Harry Jelly. Tonight, we unravel a case that is as perplexing as it is heartbreaking, a story where initial appearances proved dangerously deceptive, and the quest for truth became a labyrinth of conflicting accounts, alleged investigative missteps, and a community left reeling from the tragic loss of a young life. In September 2023, the New Mexico State Police took the step of releasing body cam and interrogation videos connected to their response to the deadly shooting of a 13-year-old girl in Questa, New Mexico. Questa, a small village in Taos County, is nestled near the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, a place known for its rugged outdoor beauty and historically tight-knit, traditional community. The footage, widely reported by news outlets at the time, purported to reveal a clear, albeit disturbing, picture of the incident that had occurred on July 28, 2023. It seemed to show a group of teenagers caught in a clumsy lie, and one parent's alleged irresponsible behavior leading to serious legal consequences under a new state law. Yet, as is so often the case in matters of life and death, the initial narrative was far from complete. Just over a year later, after multiple jury trials, the emergence of new evidence, and a painstaking re-examination of this very same footage, the story of this case looks profoundly different. Today, we're going to delve into the critical first few hours following an emergency call, a call that signaled the tragic shooting of a young teen named Amber Archuleta. Some of you may have seen snippets of this footage before, but you may not know the full, complex story that unfolded. Unfortunately for everyone involved, particularly for Amber's grieving family, the case did not simply end after arrests were made. There is much more to this tragic tale, a tale that forces us to question our initial perceptions and the very nature of justice. Let's set the scene. In the early afternoon of July 28, 2023, in the quiet village of Questa, 4 teenagers were hanging out, listening to music, and joking around, as teenagers do on a summer day. They were at the home of 14-year-old Porfirio Brown. Gathered at the Brown house with Porfirio were a few of his friends Freddie's 13-year-old younger sister, Amber Archuleta, and Amber's girlfriend, Christy, for privacy reasons. Some names of the minors involved have been changed in public records, and faces have been censored in the released footage. The mood at the Browns' property that afternoon was reportedly jovial, lighthearted. The group had even spent some time good-naturedly herding sheep into a nearby pasture. They had then returned to the house to relax for a bit. And that is when the unthinkable, the unimaginable, happened. A single gunshot rang out, shattering the afternoon's calm. 13-year-old Amber Archuleta had been shot. A frantic call was placed to 911. Freddie, Amber's older brother, took over the phone call from the distressed caller. He explained to the emergency operator that the shooting had been a drive-by. The vehicle, he stammered, was described as a black SUV. The incident, he claimed, had occurred suddenly, horrifically, out of nowhere. When the Questa Police Department arrived at the scene, they found young Amber on the ground next to the back porch of the Brown family property. Valiant, desperate efforts were made by the first responding officers to keep her alive while they anxiously awaited the arrival of emergency medical services. Her distraught brother, Freddie, lingered nearby, his shock and grief palpable. Officers pleaded with the 14-year-old to keep his distance, to give them space while they fought to save his sister's life. In these first crucial, chaotic minutes of the response, the officers' top priority was, rightly, young Amber Archuleta. She had sustained a single, devastating gunshot wound to the head. EMS arrived on scene, taking over medical efforts, but their best efforts, tragically, came too late. Freddie and Amber's father, Joshua Archuleta, his world about to crumble, rushed to the Brown property as the emergency response was ongoing. An officer had the heartbreaking task of informing him, "I'm sorry, the EMS just pronounced her deceased." The words hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. "Oh my God, man, she's gone." What? She's gone. No. Joshua's anguish was profound as he asked to see his daughter, a request an officer gently granted. As the initial shock began to settle into a grim reality, officers started the difficult process of piecing together a narrative based on the statements made by the 3 surviving teenagers, Freddie, Christy, and Porfirio Brown. In his obviously distraught state, Freddie appeared initially unable to coherently restate what he had told the 911 operator, at one point saying, "I don't remember." Later, taken away from the immediate chaos of the scene, he reiterated to investigators the story of the drive-by shooting, explaining that it had occurred from the road. Supposedly, it's a drive-by that happened near the road, an officer noted. Investigators sought out the exact area of this alleged roadside shooting to cordon it off as a crime scene, a standard and critical first step in any such investigation. The only problem was, they could find no indication whatsoever of where on the road the shooting could have taken place. There were no spent shell casings, no telltale bloodstains, and no fresh tire marks from a quickly departing SUV. "I'm looking for a casing too down there," one officer can be heard saying on body cam. "I haven't seen anything yet. They said it happened down here on the street, and that's where I'm looking." Porfirio Brown told police that Amber was shot near a dumpster, which sat in front of a neighbor's distinctive red house. He claimed they had carried her from there, wrapping her in a carpet to stanch the bleeding. "So you carried her all the way over here?" an officer asked, trying to reconcile the distances involved with the teenagers' accounts. All 3 teens, Freddie, Christy, and Porfirio, initially told the same story. Amber had been shot near the road by the dumpster and then moved towards the house. William Brown, Porfirio's father, returned home from work after receiving a frantic phone call from his son. He, too, told a similar story to officers, though he had not been present when the incident actually took place, stating his son had called him saying a girl was shot and he didn't know what to do, attributing the shooting to a black SUV. The scene around the Brown property was, by all accounts, confused and not adequately controlled in these early stages, a departure from what many would consider standard crime scene protocol. Witnesses and their parents came and went as officers continued to try and piece together the unbelievable story being fed to them by the teenagers. The assumed crime scene on the road was not immediately cordoned off because the specific area where the shooting allegedly occurred could simply not be identified based on the teens' vague and shifting descriptions. Meanwhile, the teenage witnesses themselves roamed relatively freely. William Brown, his wife Ashley, and their son Porfirio had full access to their house, a location that would later become central to the investigation. Disturbingly, both Porfirio and Freddie were absent for a period during which, it was later suggested, each may have tidied up and even changed their clothing. Then, the narrative began to crumble. Freddie and Christy, after being allowed to leave the scene with Amber's father, Joshua Archuleta, later returned. At that time, both teens indicated they wished to revise their original statements. This new version of events painted a starkly different and far more intimate picture. The group, they now said, had been spending time listening to music inside the Brown house when Porfirio pulled out a handgun. As they stood together in the kitchen, the 14-year-old, Porfirio, had directed the weapon towards Amber. Amber, they recounted, either instructed him not to point the gun at her, or perhaps also made a move to push it out of the way. In one version of this revised story, Christy stated that a brief struggle occurred over the gun before it suddenly went off. After the shot, the teenagers panicked. The group, now facing an unimaginable horror, apparently reached the desperate conclusion that they should lie about what had truly happened. Freddie claimed that Porfirio was terrified of the trouble he would be in from his father. William, even allegedly threatening to hurt himself if the others did not help him conceal the truth. And so, all 3 surviving teens agreed to concoct the drive-by shooting story. They then moved Amber's gravely wounded body from inside the house. Their initial aim, they said, was to lift her to the road where they could claim that she had been shot by a passing vehicle. They only managed to carry her as far as the back porch before stopping, overwhelmed, to call for help. The call to 911 was placed perhaps 5 to 10 crucial minutes after the gun was actually fired inside the home. Neither Freddie nor Christy, in this revised account, was able to explain what reason Porfirio would have had to intentionally fire the weapon. The mood just before the incident took place, they maintain, was characterized as jovial, just typical teenagers having a bit of fun, listening to music, and joking around after tending to some farm animals. Everyone was laughing, having a good time, Freddie stated. When asked if he felt Porfirio meant to do it, Freddie tellingly replied, "I don't know, because if you think about it, you don't see him mad or anything. But then, why would he have his finger on the trigger and just do that? So I don't really know." Christy described Porfirio pulling out a revolver, pointing it at Amber, Amber trying to move it away from her face, and then, all of a sudden, you just hear a boom. Once, it was determined that the shooting had, in fact, taken place inside the Brown house and not down the road or near the porch as initially claimed. State police investigators attempted to gain full access to the residence to process it as a crime scene. The problem they encountered, however, was that William Brown, Porfirio's father, was reportedly not cooperating, questioning their need to enter without a warrant. After William was eventually coaxed out of the house and investigators made their way inside, they noted first that there were multiple firearms left out and unsecured within the home. According to the 2 witness statements from Freddie and Christy, Porfirio had been showing off his father's gun collection to the group earlier. A rifle matching the description of one provided by Christy was reportedly still sitting out when officers entered the home. There were cartridges and other ammunition also visible in various locations. Another firearm sat just inside of an unlocked closet. When the area was finally processed as a crime scene, evidence of blood was found in the kitchen, the laundry room, and even in one of the bedrooms. Luminol, a chemical that reacts with the iron in hemoglobin to produce a blue-white glow, revealing traces of blood not visible to the naked eye, was used to identify a large section of flooring that had apparently been cleaned. Both Freddie and Christy told law enforcement that Porfirio had mopped the area before police arrived, a clear act of tampering with evidence. Porfirio Brown was promptly arrested for murder, while his father, William, continued to argue with state police, complaining about being kept from his home. The situation took another turn due to recent legislation in New Mexico. Just 5 weeks before the tragic shooting, the New Mexico state legislature had passed new gun safety legislation known as Benny's Law. This law, named in honor of Benny Hargrove, a middle school student who was shot and killed by a classmate who brought his father's unsecured gun to school, holds that parents can be held legally accountable for acts committed by their children with firearms that they had failed to keep safely stored and out of reach of minors. Dozens of firearms were ultimately seized from William Brown's home. A handful of these, investigators determined, had not been locked away but had been left unsecured and easily accessible to a minor. When William Brown made the admission to officers at the scene that not all of his guns were, in fact, secured. Most of them are secured. I have a few that are out. He was promptly arrested under the provisions of Benny's Law. Based on the body cam footage released only a few months after these events took place, the facts of what occurred at the Brown property that day seemed, at least initially, quite certain to the public and to law enforcement. The prevailing narrative was that the teenagers were looking at William Brown's extensive gun collection, which the father had negligently failed to keep safely out of their possession. Porfirio, in this version, selected a handgun, pointed it at Amber, and fired. He then allegedly concocted a lie about a drive-by shooting and coerced his friend's Amber's own girlfriend and her distraught brother to go along with it. But if the shooting was intentional, as law enforcement appeared to believe it had been, what was the 14-year-old's motive? The two, Porfirio and Amber, had been friends. Their families were reportedly close, and according to the surviving teen, they had not been arguing at the time the gun was fired. It was widely speculated in media reports that Porfirio was simply trigger-happy. The only explanation offered by some was that he loved guns and had impulsively wanted to try out a weapon on someone. Anyone. Amber, in this horrific scenario, had just been the unlucky victim. Christy even recounted that as she witnessed Porfirio pull the trigger. He was, chillingly, smiling. Joshua Archuleta, Amber's grieving father, spoke about the wonderful young woman his daughter was creative, energetic, a keen artist and musician. Amber loved playing mariachi music, a vibrant and culturally significant art form in New Mexico, often expressing themes of life, love, and heritage. Only the day before her death, she had spent hours in her room learning a Justin Bieber song on her guitar, mastering it by day's end. It was inconceivable to her family that only the next day, she would be gone. The Questa community rallied behind the Archuleta family, launching a GoFundMe page and holding vigils and rallies in support of Benny's Law, hoping such a tragedy might be prevented in the future. 14-year-old Porfirio Brown was initially charged with first-degree intentional homicide. Before the case went to trial in March 2024, however, a judge decreased the murder charge to second degree. The teen would be tried as a youthful offender solve, a specific legal category in New Mexico that allows for a disposition that can sometimes blend juvenile and adult sanctions, depending on the nature of the crime and the offender's history. Should he be found guilty, the state planned to seek a sentence for him as an adult. Porfirio also faced charges of tampering with evidence based on the cleanup job that had occurred inside the house, as well as attempted assault of a peace officer for his alleged behavior at the scene during the initial investigation. When legal arguments finally began in court, Porfirio's attorney, Lizzie Bunker, presented a theory of the crime that few, if any, had seen coming. Instead of arguing that the shooting had been a tragic accident, which many observers felt might have been a more viable, or at least understandable, defense angle, she argued that Porfirio Brown was not, in fact, the shooter at all, but she dramatically told the jury that she knew who was. Bunker boldly asserted to the jury that Porfirio had selflessly agreed to take the fall for the real killer, Amber's own brother, Freddie. She called Porfirio's mother, Ashley Baumgartner, to the stand, who testified that her son had informed her months following the shooting that it was Freddie who had fired the fatal shot. Bunker suggested that Freddie was likely so overcome with guilt and fear that he had begged his friend Porfirio to take the blame. And Porfirio, as a good and loyal friend, had tragically agreed to do so. Body cam footage shown at trial, highlighting Porfirio and Freddie in an embrace in the back of the property while Amber lay dying, and was framed by Bunker not as an act of shared grief, but as an expression of Freddie's gratitude after Porfirio had supposedly agreed to take the fall for Amber's death. "Why are you hugging my client if you just shot your sister?" Bunker rhetorically asked the jury. Bunker meticulously questioned the narrative that had seemed so obvious from the initial statements made by the other teen witnesses that day, specifically the claim that Porfirio had single-handedly created the story about the drive-by shooting and then forced the others to tell the same lie. She pointed to inconsistent statements the teens had made in various interviews since the shooting. Both eyewitnesses, Freddie and Christy, had initially used the word "we" when discussing who moved Amber's body from inside the house, only later. As their story began to unravel under police questioning, were they both asked to clarify what they meant by "we"? Had they actively helped to move Amber to cover up Porfirio's alleged crime? Both teens then significantly changed their statements. No, they insisted they did not help. They then pointed the finger of blame solely at Porfirio Brown. Bunker also highlighted that on the initial 911 call, it was Freddie, not Porfirio, who first told the operator that his sister had been shot in a drive-by. The defense also raised serious concerns about the integrity of the initial police investigation. The teen witnesses, Freddie and Christy, were allowed to leave the crime scene without being formally questioned in detail, photographed for evidence, or having their cell phones taken for examination. Body cam images captured within the first half an hour of the police response also clearly showed what appeared to be blood visible on young Freddie's arm and clothing. Both he and others were subsequently permitted to change their clothing before any forensic examination could occur. He has perfect circular spots of blood on his arm, Bunker pointed out. He's got blood on the back of his elbow, and then he goes home. So he and the other juvenile witness, they leave the scene, and they're together at another location for over an hour. Furthermore, officers inexplicably failed to search a nearby dumpster for the weapon used to kill Amber Archuleta, despite Porfirio initially claiming the drive-by happened near it. The gun that was used in the shooting went missing from the Brown home and, to this day, has never been recovered. When the lead investigator for the case, Agent Shane Faulkner, testified, he was pressed by the defense about the likelihood of one of the teens carrying the firearm away from the scene, given that they were allowed to roam freely and even leave the property for a significant period. Faulkner conceded that it was indeed possible. At no point, it was established, had either of the two primary teen witnesses, Christy or Freddie, been searched by police. The defense forcefully argued that law enforcement had developed tunnel vision from the outset, focusing solely on Porfirio Brown as the shooter. This alleged bias, Bunker contended, was further aided by the unhelpful and sometimes obstructive behavior of Porfirio's own father, William Brown, at the scene, and by other unverified assumptions made by the officers who initially responded. Adding another layer of complexity and potential bias, it emerged during the trial that one of the first responding officers to the Brown home was, in fact, cousins with Joshua Archuleta's ex-wife, meaning the officer had a familial connection, however indirect, to young Amber. Bunker argued that this officer's personal relationship may have created an unconscious tendency to foster bias in the very early stages of the investigation, increasing the likelihood that certain individuals, specifically Freddie, were never seriously considered as potential suspects, and were instead afforded what might be seen as special treatment or a lack of critical scrutiny. The jury deliberated for approximately 8 long hours. They were ultimately unable to reach a unanimous verdict. The judge, left with no alternative, declared a mistrial. After their release from service, jury members reportedly told the attorneys involved that an initial poll showed 7 of the 12 jurors thought Porfirio was guilty before deliberations even began. However, 8 hours later, after carefully weighing the evidence and Lizzie Bunker's alternative theory, only 4 jurors still believed that was the case. Crucially, even those 4 who still leaned towards Porfirio's guilt reportedly said that they believed the shooting itself was a tragic accident, not an intentional murder. And so what they're trying to charge him with is intentional murder, Bunker later commented. And all the jurors unanimously agreed that whoever the shooter was, this was an accident. Porfirio, still just a child, was left with the murder charge pending and hanging heavy over his head. William Brown, Porfirio's father, faced a maximum sentence of 18 months if convicted under Benny's law for his negligence in storing his firearms. However, the legal argument that he held direct responsibility for Amber's death was not as clear-cut as it may have seemed on the afternoon of his arrest. The central, unresolvable issue was that in the months that had passed since Amber's death, the actual gun used in the shooting was never found. New Mexico State Police determined that William Brown owned over 20 firearms. These were collected from his home and taken to forensic experts for analysis. However, not a single one of the firearms they tested came back as a match to the projectile that killed Amber. The district attorney argued that the jury did not need the alleged murder weapon to reach a guilty verdict because William Brown had admitted at the scene that the weapons inside his home were his, and that some of these were not secured. Therefore, one of his unsecured guns had to have been used to kill Amber. Investigators walked the jurors through numerous crime scene photos of the Brown home, which depicted various guns and ammunition scattered or left in easily accessible areas leaning against a wall, on a couch, on a recliner, and a handgun located underneath a mattress. William Brown testified that he was shocked when he was informed that 3 other teens had been in his home with his son while he was away at work. According to William, every one of his numerous guns was accounted for after the shooting, implying the murder weapon was not his or had been removed. His defense team posited the theory that the firearm used to shoot Amber Archuleta might not have come from the Brown household at all, but rather could have been brought to the house by one of the other teenagers, perhaps even from the home of Joshua Archuleta, Amber's father. Joshua Archuleta had stated at the scene on July 28th that there were no guns in his home. However, records showed that at an unrelated incident at his own house in 2022, police had been called out and had asked him the same question: were there any guns inside his house? At that time, official reports show Joshua Archuleta had responded, probably. What became of these hypothetical firearms 1 year later was never thoroughly investigated or properly explained during William Brown's trial. Christy, Amber's girlfriend and an eyewitness, was also called to testify at William Brown's trial. When she was asked by prosecutors who had shot Amber, she made an unfortunate and perhaps telling mistake. At first, it was Freddie's name that had slipped out of her mouth. She then quickly corrected herself. Porfirio was the shooter. She insisted. The defense, naturally, cited her slip-up as further evidence that the teen's story was unreliable and had been manipulated. Her recorded comments in relation to the gun and where it had been sourced were also not a great help to state prosecutors. In one instance, she was recorded as stating that Porfirio had pulled a gun out of nowhere. She admitted in sworn testimony that she did not see where exactly the gun had come from. The jury for William Brown's trial took less than 2 hours before returning with their verdict. We, the jury, the foreman read, find the defendant, William Brown, not guilty of negligently making a firearm accessible to a minor as charged. Porfirio Brown's retrial for the death of Amber Archuleta was scheduled to commence in August 2024. However, before it could begin, the state apparently lost confidence in their ability to obtain a conviction for the murder charge, given the outcome of the first trial and the persistent questions raised by the defense. Instead, a plea deal was reached. 14-year-old Porfirio Brown admitted to one charge of tampering with evidence. On that specific charge, the case against him had always been strong. Shoe prints identified at the bloody crime scene inside the house matched the boots that he had been wearing that day. Furthermore, witnesses had stated they saw him mopping an area in the kitchen, and neighbors had recounted that they observed him changing his clothing after the shooting took place. For tampering with evidence, Porfirio Brown received 1 year of probation. In the aftermath of this plea deal, Amber Archuleta's grieving family offered a statement expressing their profound disappointment, merged with their ongoing, unbearable grief over the result of their already horrific ordeal. They highlighted what they perceived as the utter failure of the Questa and New Mexico State Police Departments, and of the justice system as a whole, to deliver true justice for Amber. They stated, Amber Archuleta's young, bright, and loving life was taken, and there is nothing that the criminal justice system can deliver that will help in the recovery of such a tragic loss. They were particularly disgusted by the defense's strategy in Porfirio's case of trying to blame Amber's own brother, Freddie, for the shooting. We're in shock, a family representative said, still grieving and having to deal with this. Today's court is I think it's just the worst thing that anyone can experience. We strongly believe that wasn't an accident and he needs to be behind bars. We are fearful for ourselves and for any other person that he decides he wants to shoot. And that was the tragic, convoluted, and ultimately deeply unsatisfying case of Amber Archuleta, a young life lost, and a justice system that, in the eyes of many, failed to provide clear answers or accountability. Thank you for joining me on Crime Enigma. I'm Harry Jelly. We'll explore another mystery next time.